Imagine the city of Alexandria at night. The streets are alive with whispers and laughter. Torches burn brightly in harbors, and over the sea drifts the scent of wine, incense, and spice. The royal palace, crowned with marble columns, glimmers like a jewel. Inside, the great Roman conqueror, Julius Caesar, sits upon a throne, weary, cautious, yet ever commanding. His hands, so accustomed to the way of the sword, now rest quietly on the arms of the chair. Soldiers usher in servants, messengers, gifts. But on this night, a surprise awaited him. Before Caesar, they placed a massive carpet, rolled so tightly it seemed more like a bundle than a treasure. The carpet was unrolled, and from within, like a butterfly from its cocoon, emerged a young woman. Her dark hair fell loosely across her shoulders. Her eyes shone with a daring, almost tender fire. She bowed her head, not like a slave, but like a queen who knew her worth. This was Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, standing before Caesar for the first time. She had not come to beg for mercy. She had come to conquer his heart. And in that moment, her life, and the fate of all Egypt, would never be the same. But this is not merely a story of passion. It is a story of power, of survival, of the wealth and majesty of Alexandria. It is the tale of how one woman became the symbol of an age. Within it lies everything: palace intrigue, whispered secrets, the sensual glow of banquets, great battles, and the quiet solitude of final nights. So settle in and let my voice carry you through time, to the banks of the Nile, to the days when Egypt still stood as the heart of the ancient world. And if you enjoy journeys into the past, stories that blend calm and drama, beauty and tragedy, do not forget to subscribe to Slow Dreams. Here, the greatest mysteries of history are reborn every night. And now, let us lift the veil and step into the life of Cleopatra. The Egypt into which Cleopatra was born was no longer the same land that once raised the pyramids and built temples for the gods. The glorious days of Ramses and Tutankhamun had long passed. In their place remained ruins and memories of an age when Egypt dictated terms of the world. Now the country stood at a crossroads, rich, magnificent, yet fragile. Its rulers, the Ptolemaic dynasty, did not descend from the ancient pharaohs, but from Macedonian Greeks, heirs of Alexander the Great. They spoke Greek, lived by Greek customs, yet sat upon the throne of Egypt. To the people, they were both respected and resented. A farmer tilling the soil along the Nile saw them as outsiders. Yet they were kings and queens, and to many still divine. Among Egypt's cities, one shone brightest, Alexandria, a city of libraries and its great lighthouse, where scholars, poets, merchants, and travelers from across the Mediterranean gathered. In its narrow streets, 100 languages mingled. In its markets, Romans, Phoenicians, Jews, Greeks, and Egyptians traded. The air carried the scent of tar from ships, fresh fish, spices from India, and the heavy aroma of Egyptian wine. But behind this splendor lay unease. Egypt was a tempting prize for empires. Its fertile land produced harvests that could feed half of Rome. Its gold and jewels lured every conqueror. And though its palaces glittered, its armies were weak. Egypt's rulers relied not on strength, but on cunning, alliances, and bribes to hold off enemies. Within the Ptolemaic palace, surrounded by marble and gold, there was no peace. Brothers and sisters schemed against each other. Plots twisted through the corridors like shadows. Poison and betrayal were whispered as often as prayers. And it was in this world that a young girl named Cleopatra grew up. From childhood, she learned two truths. The first, Egypt was vulnerable, and only wit and guile could save it from destruction. The second, true power belonged not to those who wielded the sword, but to those who could capture hearts and minds. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak ruler. He was feared not for his strength, but for his whims. He squandered gold on feasts instead of armies. He purchased Rome's support by offering treasures rather than loyalty. And the young Cleopatra understood. If her father left behind only a fractured throne and bitter siblings, one day she would be forced to fight for her very survival. Alexandria sang a song of splendor, but beneath its melody was a whisper of danger. And that whisper, Cleopatra learned to hear even before she learned to read. At the very heart of a Ptolemaic palace, among marble columns and the scent of incense, a child was born who would one day become the last queen of Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra. Yet long before she appeared on the stage of history, she was only a little girl, watching a world where love and betrayal walked hand in hand, where glory was never far from fear. The palace in which she grew up was like a world unto itself. It did not echo with the simple sound of childhood. No laughter of friends in the streets, no games in the dust. Instead, Cleopatra heard the measured steps of guards, the rustle of silk gowns, the aroma of wine flowing freely at banquets, and the whispers of intrigues that never ceased day or night. From her earliest years, she was taught silence and listening. In the palace, every word could become a weapon. She sat in the shadows of the columns and heard brothers quarrel with their father, her mother commanding servants to bring gifts to the gods, advisors whispering about Rome. A child's ears caught more than they should. Yet this made her wise before she was grown. Cleopatra was different from her sisters. They found delight in jewels, silks, and diversions. She longed for more. From childhood, she showed a rare hunger for knowledge. She was taught by Alexandria's best scholars, mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric. She studied Greek, Latin, and the tongues of peoples along the Nile. It is said she knew no fewer than 7 languages, a rare gift among rulers who seldom bothered to understand their subjects. Once, still very young, Cleopatra slipped away from her attendants and wandered into the city. Alexandria met her with the roar of the marketplace. She listened to merchants shouting in many tongues, sailors laughing as they drank cheap wine, children running through the alleys. And in that moment she understood, to rule a country, one must know it heart. And that heart beat not in the palaces, but among the people. Yet not only wisdom and learning shaped Cleopatra. The palace whispered with legends of gods and passions, of love and betrayal. She heard tales of Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, and of Isis, the eternal mother. These myths often carried a sensual note, and for a young girl, they sounded like secret lessons. She learned that feminine allure could be as sharp a weapon as the sword. Her earliest steps in the art of charm were innocent. A playful glance at a servant, words spoken with both gentleness and command. But behind them lay the shadow of the great power she would one day wield. At night, while other children slept, Cleopatra would step onto the palace terrace and gaze upon the Nile. The river flowed slowly, majestically, carrying its waters from distant mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. She knew, so too would her life flow, through intrigues, passions, and trials. And perhaps one day, her name would be bound forever with the fate of Egypt itself. When Cleopatra was only 17, her life changed suddenly. Her father, Ptolemy XII, died, leaving behind a throne divided among his children. By ancient Egyptian custom, to legitimize her rule, Cleopatra was forced to share power with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, barely 10 years old. One might think that the elder sister would naturally guide the realm, but in truth, things were very different. Behind the boy stood powerful courtiers, ruthless, ambitious men who saw in him nothing more than a puppet to serve their own designs. From the very beginning, conflict flared between brother and sister. Cleopatra was far too clever, too independent, too commanding to play the role of decoration upon the throne. She longed to rule in her own right. She began minting coins bearing only her face, appeared before the people as her sovereign, and even personally took part in legal trials, something unheard of for a queen. The people saw in her the strength long absent from the weakening Ptolemaic line. But the men at court could not endure it. They spread rumors about her, that she was licentious, that she practiced sorcery, that she was an enemy to her own people. Her allies began to vanish one by one, until at last her brother and his advisors forced her from the palace. Exile was harsh. Cleopatra found herself in the desert, far from the splendor of Alexandria. Yet there, amid the sands, a plan was born. She gathered mercenaries, won support among Egyptian tribes, and began preparing to return. Her heart knew no fear. She was still young, but already schooled in intrigue and politics. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, her brother's rule was brittle. The people saw his weakness. He was a child, a mask worn by others. Anger grew among the common folk. They remembered the young woman who spoke their tongue, who came before them without fear, who dared to walk among them. And it was at this moment that Rome entered Egypt's fate. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey, and within this political storm, Cleopatra saw her chance. She knew that if she could win Caesar's heart, she would gain not only an ally but the sword to reclaim her throne. Thus occurred the legendary scene that passed into history. Cleopatra ordered her servants to wrap her in a carpet, or, as some sources say, in a sack of cloth, and smuggle her into Caesar's chambers. When the bundle was unrolled, the young queen stood before the greatest conqueror of her time. Her eyes shone with courage and wit. It was a moment where risk, passion, and destiny intertwined. Historians tell us Caesar smiled when he saw her. She was not merely a girl seeking protection. She was a ruler offering alliance. And from that moment, her path back to Alexandria began anew, more dangerous, more daring, and far more glorious. The carpet was unrolled slowly, and all in the chamber froze in astonishment. The folds of fabric fell like the waves of the Nile, and from within its depths emerged the shadow of a woman's form. A servant stepped back in shock, and the Roman soldiers stiffened, their hands instinctively tightening on their swords. And then, as though born from the heart of legend itself, Cleopatra appeared. Her dark, flowing hair tumbled over her shoulders, catching the glow of the torches like strands of polished obsidian. A delicate chain of gold rested upon her neck, but it was not jewels that commanded the room. It was her eyes, large, luminous, and alive, like two black pearls fixed on Caesar. In their depths burned a light that mingled courage with tenderness, calculation with desire. She did not fall at his feet, nor bow in servitude. Her posture was regal, upright, and unyielding, as though she herself dictated the terms of this encounter. A faint smile brushed her lips, and that smile was more dangerous than any drawn blade. Her beauty was not the cold perfection of marble goddesses. It was warm, living, and irresistible in every movement. When she raised her hand to brush back a strand of hair, the gesture seemed deliberate, a subtle command veiled in softness. Her body, draped in a thin veil of linen, spoke its own language, not adorned treasures, but the woman herself was the greatest treasure of Egypt. Caesar, who had seen the most powerful and wealthy women of Rome, could not look away. Before him stood not merely a young beauty, but queen, who knew how to rule not only a nation, but also the gaze and the will of a man. In that moment, before she spoke a single word, Cleopatra had already won. When Cleopatra stood before Julius Caesar, it was not merely the meeting of two people. It was a collision of two worlds. He, the general who had conquered Gaul, defeated his enemies in Rome, and now held the future of the greatest empire in his hands. She, a young queen, stripped of her throne, yet burning with the determination to win it back at any cost. That night, when they were left alone, Cleopatra spoke first. Her voice was soft, yet steady. She told him of Egypt, of its fertile fields that fed Rome, of its treasures that could enrich any ally. But beneath the lines of her words ran another language, The language of her eyes, of fleeting touches, of meanings that could never be written into any treaty. Caesar listened in silence. He saw before him not simply a woman, but a ruler who played two games at once, the political and the sensual. He had faced hundreds of commanders and dozens of senators, yet never had he encountered such a woman. In her presence, even he, the man accustomed to dictating the terms, felt that here the game was played as equals. That night they spoke long into the hours. Cleopatra told him of the goddess Isis, of the power a woman could wield when wisdom and beauty were joined together. She sat close by, her fingers brushing his hand now and then, seemingly by accident, yet enough to quicken his pulse. She knew that to win Caesar, she needed not only arguments, but also the subtle magic of closeness. When dawn touched Alexandria, Caesar no longer doubted. He declared Cleopatra the rightful queen of Egypt. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, remained an enemy, but now she had an ally strong enough to alter the course of history. This alliance was not born solely in the chambers of advisors, but in the quiet of nighttime conversations, in the flicker of torchlight, in the whispers left between two people. And though historians would write of treaties and campaigns, the true pact was sealed far deeper. In that place where two hearts meet and recognize in each other the power to change the world. Caesar became witness to what it meant to be ruler of Egypt. He was shown the library, where thousands of scrolls preserved the knowledge of all mankind. He was led into treasuries where gold and silver lay piled like the sands of the Nile. But more than all these wonders, it was Cleopatra herself who astonished him most. She knew that the greatness of her kingdom lay not only in temples and pyramids, but in the art of leaving an impression. At the banquet, she appeared adorned in gowns that shimmered with pearls and emeralds. Her body was wrapped in garments so sheer that her beauty was suggestive rather than revealed, never vulgar, always tantalizing. She sat beside Caesar, and the entire hall seemed to pause. Her voice rang bright and warm, her laughter musical, her movements graceful. Every gesture appeared deliberate. Every word held two meanings, one for the room, another for him. It was then that the legendary scene occurred, retold for centuries to come, to prove that she could squander the greatest treasure in a single instant. Cleopatra called for a goblet of wine and the great pearl that adorned her earring. She dropped it into the wine. The acid dissolved it, and she drank it down in a single swallow. "Yes," she said, locking her eyes upon Caesar's. "For those who rule the world, there is no such thing as a price." Caesar laughed, but in his laughter there was more than amusement. He saw that this woman was not playing a part. She truly believed she could stand equal with the gods. The banquets went on through the night. Wine flowed like rivers. Musicians played their harps and flutes. Dancers twisted their bodies into hypnotic forms. Yet all of this was merely backdrop for the central performance, the performance of Cleopatra. She was the star around whom the entire hall revolved. She could be tender and commanding, measured and passionate, all in the same breath. For Caesar, these nights were more than celebration. They were proof that Egypt was not simply another province. It was the heart of an ancient civilization where a woman could be queen, lover, and goddess all at once. And each time dawn broke over the Nile, Caesar felt it more strongly. In Cleopatra, he had found not only an ally, he had found his equal. On a sweltering summer's day, Alexandria was shaken by news that rippled through the palace and across the land of Egypt. The queen had borne a son. He was given the name Ptolemy XV, but at all he was known by another, Caesar, the little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this child was more than an heir. In him she saw the symbol of union between Egypt and Rome. In his veins flowed the legacy of two great worlds, that of the pharaohs and the Caesars. She believed that one day he could unite them and grant Egypt new strength. In the first days after his birth, Cleopatra would hold her son for hours. gazing into his face and whispering ancient songs once sung by Egyptian mothers in the time of the pyramids. She spoke to him not only of love, but of power. Her lullabies were closer to prayers than to tender words. You will be stronger than I. You will be the one to save this land. Yet she also knew the birth of this child was not only a blessing, but a danger. In Rome, many saw it as a provocation. Cleopatra's son was a direct rival to Caesar's legitimate heirs. To some, he was proof of greatness. To others, he was a threat that must be erased. Though Caesar only acknowledged him half officially, Cleopatra made certain that in Egypt he was seen as the future pharaoh. She commissioned paintings and statues that showed Caesar Ion standing beside the gods. She carried him in her own arms before the people, declaring with her presence that in her child lay the future of the kingdom. In those years, Alexandria lived in a world of contrasts. On one hand, splendor and banquets, the grandeur of the library, trade that stretched beyond all borders. On the other, fear of Rome. In every street there lingered the shadow of legions, which at any moment might march in and take all. And within this anxious harmony, Cleopatra raised Caesar Ion. She taught him not only love for Egypt, but cunning, diplomacy, and the reading of men's hearts. She wanted him to become a ruler who could be warrior, sage, and God in the eyes of his people. Yet Cleopatra herself knew well, history rarely grants peace. And each day, as she looked into her son's eyes, she felt it deeply. For those eyes, she would one day have to fight. Rome, in the spring of 44 BC, was like a volcano ready to erupt. The streets were decorated with triumphal arches. Senators praised Caesar, but in their hearts smoldered envy and fear. He had grown too great for a city that despised kings. Cleopatra was still in Alexandria then, yet news traveled faster than the wind. And one day, a message arrived that changed everything. Julius Caesar was dead. He had been stabbed to death in the Senate itself, murdered by the very men he once called his friends. For Egypt, it meant catastrophe. The alliance Cleopatra had built for years vanished in an instant. Now her son, little Caesar Ion, was in peril. In Rome, voices already whispered that he had no rightful claim to his father's legacy. Cleopatra stepped out onto the terrace of her palace, gazing at the Nile in silence. She remembered his smile, his voice, that first moment when he had seen her unroll from the carpet. And she knew now she was alone. Whatever came next, she would have to play a new game. Meanwhile, Rome was in chaos. Caesar's friends and foes tore the state apart. On the stage now appeared Mark Antony, a soldier and trusted ally of the slain dictator, and the young heir Octavian, the man who would one day be called Augustus. Cleopatra quickly understood. If she wished to preserve Egypt and secure Caesarion's future, she would have to choose again. The past was gone forever. Before her lay a new story, more dangerous, more passionate. Her alliance with Caesar had ended in blood. But another was already approaching with Mark Antony, and that union would be louder, more legendary, and far more tragic. When news of Caesar's death shook the world, many believed Cleopatra would lose everything. But she was not one to surrender. She knew that to preserve Egypt, she needed a new alliance, and that ally could be Mark Antony, Caesar's closest companion, a man of immense strength and even greater ambition. Their first meeting became the stuff of legend. Antony was in Tarsus when Cleopatra decided to appear before him not as a supplicant, but as a goddess. She sailed down the river on a golden barge, its sails dyed purple, its oars moving in rhythm to the music of flutes. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a silver canopy, dressed to resemble Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Crowds gathered along the banks to witness the marvel. The scent of incense and roses drifted across the water. Antony, hardened by brutal campaigns and the stench of battlefields, froze in awe at the spectacle. Before him was not merely a woman, Before him stood a legend brought to life. When she stepped ashore, her pace was slow and assured. Her eyes shone with the same fire that had once ensnared Caesar, but now it burned brighter, tempered by wisdom and sharpened by years of struggle. Antony made no attempt to hide his admiration. He was a soldier who had stared death in the face, but never such magnificence. Cleopatra spoke to him not as to a conqueror, but as to an equal. She knew, if she wished to win his devotion, she must offer him not only passion, but the sense that he was chosen by the gods themselves. And from that moment, something greater than politics was born between them. It was a spark that flared into flame, a great passion that would change not only their lives, but the fate of empires. The meeting in Tarsus was only the beginning. When Mark Antony came to Alexandria, he entered a world where night and day lost their meaning, for life flowed in an endless stream of feast, music, and pleasure. Cleopatra's palace blazed with thousands of lights. Golden statues of the gods adorned the halls. The air was heavy with the scent of resin and roses, and tables bent beneath the weight of dishes unknown even to Rome's richest senators. Exotic fruits from Africa, wines from Greece, fish drawn from the depths of the Red Sea, all were served to the sound of harps and flutes. Antony, hardened by years of harsh military campaigns, was at first overwhelmed. But the longer he remained at Cleopatra's side, the more reality seemed to slip away. Here, in Alexandria, he was no mere general. He was a god chosen for delight. Cleopatra knew how to turn every evening into a spectacle. She would appear in gowns encrusted with pearls, or in sheer, diaphanous fabrics that made her body glow in the torchlight. She raised her cups of wine, laughed with melody that echoed across the halls, and spoke words that could be both jest and political declaration. Together they formed a secret fellowship they called the Society of Inseparables. Its members swore to abandon themselves to pleasure each night without restraint. They drank until dawn, devised games, mocked senators and kings, and each evening surpassed the last in extravagance. Their banquets became legendary. One story tells of the night Cleopatra and Antony wagered on who could spend the greatest sum in a single feast. To prove her power, Cleopatra repeated her old trick. She dissolved the world's most precious pearl in a goblet of wine and drank it in a single swallow. Even Antony, no stranger to excess, was struck silent. He admitted defeat and acknowledged her as mistress not only of Egypt but of their passion as well. Yet behind the luxury lurked politics. Cleopatra knew well, as long as Antony remained enchanted, he would stand as her ally against Octavian. She fed his pride, granted him the feeling of greatness, and at the same time held his heart firmly in her hands. All Alexandria lived by these nights. People whispered that the queen and the Roman general had surpassed even the myths of the gods, while others foretold that such passion could end only in tragedy. Indeed, each banquet was not only a celebration, it was also a shadow of the downfall to come, for beyond the palace walls the anger of Rome was already growing. After the grand banquets and nights of passion, came a time when Cleopatra and Antony began to live not only as lovers, but as a family. They had 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. For Cleopatra, these were not merely children of love, but symbols of a future union between 2 worlds. In Alexandria, people whispered that the queen had changed. She was no longer only the temptress, the goddess of pleasure. Now she could spend hours by the cradle, holding her little ones in her arms, singing them ancient songs of Egypt's goddesses. She saw in the continuation of her power, her people, her dream. Antony, too, discovered something new in these children. A soldier who had spent his life among battlefields and blood now felt the warmth of home. When he played with the children or watched them take their first steps, a gentleness stirred within him that none of his legionaries had ever seen. In those moments, he was not a general. He was a father, But as always, nothing in their lives was ever just so. The birth of these children carried political weight as well. Cleopatra ensured that images of their family were displayed in temples and during festivals. She wanted her people to see in these children the future rulers who would unite Rome and Egypt. She even revived the ancient cult of Isis, portraying herself as a goddess mother and her children as divine heirs. To ordinary Egyptians, this was a sign that the gods themselves had blessed the union of their queen and the Roman warrior. In Rome, however, the news caused unease. There, whispers spread that Antony had betrayed his homeland, that he had become enslaved to an Eastern queen. His enemies claimed he had abandoned Rome for Eastern luxury, and that his children were dangerous rivals to Rome's legitimate heirs. And yet, despite the fears and plots, for Cleopatra these years were perhaps the happiest of her life. She had the man she loved, children of her own, and a kingdom that still belonged to her. She knew the storm was inevitable, but in those quiet moments by the Nile, it seemed to her that even fate might be deceived. The years of happiness in Alexandria passed swiftly. From the west came news that Caesar's young heir, Octavian, was consolidating his power in Rome. He was unlike Antony, cold, calculating, and reserved. He possessed neither passion nor generosity, but he held the most dangerous qualities of all, patience and ambition. Octavian watched Antony and Cleopatra closely. To him, their union was no love story. It was a threat. He saw in Cleopatra's children rivals who could challenge his claim to power. He heard tales of their banquets and revelries, and he turned those stories into weapons. In Rome, slogans spread. Antony has betrayed Rome. He is a slave of an Eastern queen. Antony still tried to balance his duties. He waged campaigns in the East, fought in Parthia, but each time returned to Cleopatra. His heart remained in Alexandria, and that was his greatest weakness. Tension mounted. Octavian and Antony, once allies, now became sworn enemies. At last, the inevitable came, war. And this war would decide the fate not only of Rome, but of the entire Mediterranean. Cleopatra knew their chances were fragile. Egypt had gold, but no legions. Antony had an army, but his soldiers were weary. Still, she did not retreat. She ordered ships to be built, armies gathered, allies summoned. Alexandria braced itself for the final struggle. The climax came at the Battle of Actium. In September of 31 BC, two fleets clashed off the coast of Greece. On one side stood Octavian's legions. On the other, Antony's forces and Cleopatra's ships. The sky was thick with smoke. Sails were torn apart. The sea burned with flaming vessels. Amid the chaos, Cleopatra made the fateful decision. She withdrew her fleet, turning her ships away from battle. Antony, seeing her departure, rushed after her. His soldiers, left leaderless, collapsed into disarray. The result was ruin. Antony's fleet was destroyed, and victory belonged to Octavian. From that day forward, Egypt's fate was sealed. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria. The city still glittered with splendor, but within its walls echoed the sound of defeat. Both knew their story was now rushing inexorably toward its tragic end. The defeat at Actium was the beginning of the end for Antony. Not long ago, he had commanded armies, been Caesar's trusted ally, and stood among the most powerful men in the world. Now he returned to Alexandria with a shattered fleet, a handful of weary soldiers, and a heart that knew no peace. In the palace, he wandered in silence, a shadow of the man he once was. His broad shoulders, once proud and unyielding, now drooped. He drank wine endlessly, yet drunkenness brought no oblivion. It only sharpened the sting of his loss. He remembered days of triumph, the cheers as he entered Rome, the golden chariot where he sat beside Caesar. Each memory cut into him like a blade. Antony looked at Cleopatra with torment in his eyes. He loved her, yet he blamed her. She was to him both the cause of his ruin and the meaning of his life. Their conversations grew sharp, quarrels flaring like sparks. But after every clash, they found each other again, in embraces, in kisses, in that consuming passion that bound them until the end. Then came the news that Octavian's armies were already at Egypt's gates. Alexandria braced for siege. Antony tried to rouse his soldiers, but their eyes held only despair. They no longer believed in victory, and he saw it. Yet the cruelest blow was still to come. Word reached him that Cleopatra was dead. It was a lie, born of deception, but for Antony it was a final spark of despair. He threw himself upon his own sword. Blood stained the marble beneath him, but death did not take him at once. His men lifted his broken body and carried him to the queen, and there, in Cleopatra's chambers, came their last farewell. When he was laid before her, she cried out in horror and rushed to him. She cradled his head in her lap, kissed lips that still tasted of wine and blood. His fading eyes gazed into hers, burning with love and agony. "Do not weep," Antony whispered. "I have lived the life of a soldier, and if I must die, let it be in your arms." Cleopatra bent over him, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with the crimson of his wounds. She whispered, "We will meet again, in a world where there is no Rome, no war, only you and I." And he smiled one last time. His head sank, his breath grew still. Mark Antony, soldier, lover, and conqueror, was gone. In the silence that followed, as the torches dimmed and the cries of the city faded, Cleopatra understood. She now stood alone before her fate, and the last game was yet to be played. The death of Antony struck Cleopatra like a blow, yet at the same time it marked the beginning of a new chapter. She was alone now, a queen without her king, a lover without her beloved, and yet she remained a queen, and even in the shadow of tragedy she would not let herself fall. Alexandria still stood, but Octavian's legions already surrounded the city. Rome breathed down Egypt's neck. In the streets, people whispered in fear, merchants hid their wares, and the palace of silence lingered that felt like a death shroud. Cleopatra understood. Only one chance remained. She would have to play her last game, if not by strength of arms, then by the power of words and beauty. She might yet bend fate. She ordered the hall to be adorned for her meeting with Octavian. Purple draperies hung from the columns. The fragrance of incense filled the chambers, and Cleopatra herself dressed as the goddess Isis. Emeralds shone at her neck. Gold sparkled in her hair. She prepared not for battle, but for a performance, and the stage belonged to her alone. When Octavian entered the palace, he did not see a defeated queen, but a woman who carried herself with the same dignity she had shown before Caesar and Antony. She did not kneel. She did not beg. She looked directly into his eyes. "Egypt can still be your ally," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "My gold, my people, my heart will serve Rome, if you grant a future to my children." Octavian listened in silence. His face betrayed no emotion. Before him stood the woman who had conquered the hearts of two of Rome's greatest men, but he was different. He had none of Caesar's passion, none of Antony's reckless hunger. His heart was cold, his purpose absolute power. "In Rome," he replied, "there can be no other gods but Rome itself, and no heirs but those I choose." Cleopatra understood then. He would give her no chance. He wanted her as a trophy, paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, forced to walk before his chariot in his triumph. But Cleopatra could never endure such humiliation. Her life had been filled with passion, luxury, and grandeur. She had given herself to love, to politics, to struggle, but she had never lived on her knees. And so she decided, if this was to be her final game, then she would end on her own terms. She dismissed her advisors, said farewell to her children, and remained only with her most trusted attendants. She was no longer preparing for negotiations, nor for triumph. She was preparing for her own legend. In the dark corridors of the palace, the echoes of Octavian's soldiers still lingered. Alexandria was silent, its gardens withered, and the sea no longer sang with joy. At the heart of the palace, Cleopatra remained alone with her fate. She knew the next day she would be led in chains. She would become a spectacle for Rome, a trophy for Octavian. She, who once appeared before Caesar wrapped in a carpet, who had bewitched Antony and borne him children, would now be paraded as a humiliated symbol of defeat that she could not allow. Cleopatra sat in her chambers, adorned like a goddess. She commanded to be dressed in golden robes once reserved for festivals, her hair crowned with a diadem, her body adorned with jewels that gleamed like stars. She wanted, even in death, to be seen not as a captive, but as a queen. By her side stood two faithful attendants, IRAs and Charmian. They had been with her since youth, had seen her triumphs and her losses, her loves and her griefs. Now they gazed upon their queen through tears, knowing they too would follow her. "Are you afraid?" IRAs asked in a trembling voice. Cleopatra smiled. "I fear only one thing, to forget who I am. I am Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile. My death will belong to me, not to Rome." She looked long into a mirror, reflected there was not the youthful beauty who had once entered Caesar's chambers, but a woman who had walked through passion, war, and loss. Yet even now her eyes burned, proud, defiant, majestic. That night she walked once more among her treasures. Statues of the gods, fine fabrics, scrolls from a library. She touched them as if bidding farewell. She knew that no possession was worth what she was about to do. But still, she wished to leave this world remembered not only as a woman, but as a queen who lived and died on her own terms. She sat upon her golden throne and closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw Antony, his smile, his voice. She whispered, "Wait for me. Soon I will come." Morning came. The sun slowly rose above the Nile, its light spilling through the palace windows, gilding the walls. Cleopatra sat upon her throne, radiant in the glow. Yet within that radiance lay something solemn, the last dawn of her life. Her attendants brought a basket of fruit, as they often did. But hidden inside was a symbol of her fate, a small cobra whose venom was swift and certain. Cleopatra gazed at it for a long while, as if at an old companion. To the Egyptians, the serpent was sacred. It adorned the crowns of the pharaohs, a sign of divine power and protection. And so Cleopatra chose. If she was to die, it would be in the embrace of the creature that had symbolized Egypt's royalty since the dawn of time. She took the snake in her hands, its body coiling slowly around her wrist. In that moment, she was no longer a woman, nor a captive, nor a lover. She was a goddess, choosing her own fate. "I will not go in chains," she said, her eyes fixed on her attendants. "I will not be a spectacle for crowd. Let Rome see only my legend." IRAs sobbed. Charmian fell to her knees. Yet neither turned away. They remained by her side, as they had vowed in their youth. Cleopatra raised her hand, and the serpent struck. A fleeting sting, a sharp breath, and the queen's blood carried the venom. She leaned back, her eyes still shining, but now with a calm acceptance. "Antony, I come to you," she whispered. Her body slowly relaxed, as though she were drifting into sleep. Upon her lips lingered a faint smile, as if she saw not death before her, but her beloved, waiting in eternity. IRAs and Charmian chose to follow their queen into death. And when Octavian's soldiers entered the chamber, they found Cleopatra seated on a throne, adorned in gold, serene as the statue of a goddess. Her death was her victory. She had not become Rome's trophy, but remained Egypt's legend. From that day, Cleopatra's name belonged no longer to the earth. It lived on in history, in legend, in the dreams of those who believe that even in the face of defeat, one can remain a victor. When the news of Cleopatra's death reached Rome, the streets erupted in triumph. Octavian celebrated his victory. He had gained what he desired most, dominion over the world. Yet even in his moment of glory, he knew he had failed to break the last queen of Egypt. For Cleopatra did not leave life as a captive, nor as a trophy, but as a woman who chose her own fate. Centuries passed. Egypt became just another Roman province, and Octavian's name changed to Augustus, the first emperor. His statue stood in cities, his laws governed millions of lives. But does the world remember him as vividly as it remembers Cleopatra? Cleopatra endured in songs and legends. Her image lived in the verses of poets, in the paintings of artists, in the dreams of lovers. She became a symbol of passion and power, of love and tragedy. To some, she was a seductress. To others, a wise ruler who fought for her people until the very end. Her story reminds us that true power does not lie only in swords or crowns. It lies in the ability to leave behind a mark that shines through the ages. In the silence of the night, when the waters of the Nile brush against its banks, it seems her name still drifts in the air. Cleopatra, the woman who conquered the hearts of the world's greatest men. The woman who never let her enemies strip away her dignity. The woman who became an immortal legend. And if you have listened to this story until the end, remember, Cleopatra's legacy is not merely in gold or thrones. It is in the belief that even a single life can change the course of history. So let this story remain with you, like the gentle whisper of an ancient world. Close your eyes, and perhaps you too will hear the waves of the Nile carrying her name through time. Cleopatra,